Tonight, we're stepping quietly into one of the most misunderstood spaces of medieval life, a place wrapped in myth, half-truths, and centuries of imagination. Not the dramatic torture chambers from movies, not the chaotic underground labyrinths from video games, but the real historical dungeons that existed beneath castles, courts, and city walls. These places were far simpler, far quieter, and in many ways far more revealing about how medieval society worked. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video if you enjoy these calm, late-night journeys into history. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to watch our little nighttime community gather from all across the world. Now dim the lights, adjust your pillow, and let the world soften a little around you. Tonight we walk slowly downward, not into horror, but into history. Not into fear, but into understanding. This is what it was really like inside a medieval dungeon. The first thing we need to understand is that medieval dungeons were never designed to be places of constant cruelty. Their purpose was far more administrative. Medieval justice moved slowly. Trials were delayed by travel, weather, or bureaucratic procedures. Conflicts between lords required time to negotiate. Debts required verification. Ransom agreements required letters to be carried across kingdoms. All of this meant people needed to be held somewhere until decisions could be made. And so, the dungeon became a waiting room for the medieval world, a place where time moved differently, where days passed in silence, where the outcome of a person's future hovered somewhere above, in the halls of power they could not see. Most people who ended up in these spaces were not hardened criminals. Many were simply individuals caught in disputes, travelers who owed debts, political figures who had become inconvenient, or minor offenders awaiting the next step of a legal process that might take weeks or months. The dungeon was less a punishment and more a holding space carved from stone. But being a holding space did not make it comfortable. The design itself, deep underground, away from sunlight and warmth, created an environment that shaped every moment a prisoner experienced inside. As your eyes adjust to the stillness of this underground world, something else begins to emerge. Something that has nothing to do with stone or architecture, and everything to do with the people who watched over these spaces. The guards who walked the corridors, the officials who kept the keys, the administrators who handled records and fees. Their presence shaped life in the depths just as much as the walls themselves. Guards were not faceless figures of myth, nor were they the dramatic villains imagined in later novels. They were ordinary medieval workers, often former soldiers, sometimes aging retainers of a noble household who could no longer ride into battle. Many had seen more winters than wars, and their armor, if they wore any, was mismatched and practical rather than imposing. Their job demanded endurance more than brutality. They had to walk the same cold corridors every day, monitor cells that rarely changed, and manage an environment where routine was the only constant. Some guards approached their work with detachment, performing their duties with the same steady pace as a miller turning a wheel. Others took an interest in the people held here, sometimes offering small kindnesses that cost nothing, like sharing a rumor from the world above or providing a moment of conversation. A few took pride in maintaining order without cruelty, seeing themselves as stewards of a necessary but unpleasant part of society. Their attitudes varied as widely as the personalities of any medieval town. Their challenges were considerable. A guard had to remain attentive in a place that seemed designed to dull the senses. The sameness of stone, the stillness of air, the predictable rhythm of daily rounds, all could lull even a disciplined mind into fatigue. Yet guards bore responsibility not only for keeping prisoners confined, but for ensuring the facility functioned. They checked ventilation shafts to prevent them from clogging. They monitored water levels during seasonal surges. They coordinated repairs when wooden beams weakened or when moisture eroded mortar between stones. Some guards had to balance professional duties with the emotional weight of interacting with long-term prisoners. Human beings, no matter how carefully separated by law and stone, inevitably formed impressions of one another. A guard who saw the same prisoner every day for years might develop a familiarity that was difficult to ignore. They might notice changes in demeanor, shifts in mood, or signs of illness long before any official record caught up. The relationship was rarely simple. It existed in a space between authority and reluctant companionship, shaped less by sympathy and more by the quiet reality of shared routine. A guard might be the only person a prisoner spoke to for weeks. That fragile connection, even when minimal, shaped the emotional landscape of life below ground. Above the guards were officials who managed administrative details. They kept track of who entered and who left, recorded fees, documented sentences when such records existed, and coordinated with courts or noble households. Their small offices, often located above ground near the main gate, were filled with parchment rolls, wooden ledger boards, and piles of messages carried by couriers. Through their hands passed the bureaucratic lifeblood of the medieval justice system. To step into one of these offices, had we been able, would have been like stepping into the nervous system of the entire institution. There were notes recording the dates of arrests, lists describing minor offenses, letters from families pleading for leniency or clarification, occasional orders from higher authorities changing a prisoner's status without explanation. These documents, though mundane at first glance, were the threads that tied the quiet depths below to the vibrant, unpredictable world above. The officials themselves were rarely dramatic figures. They were clerks trained to read and write, often with modest education from a monastery or cathedral school. They worked long hours by candlelight, updating records that were essential but seldom celebrated. Their decisions could subtly reshape the fate of a prisoner. A misplaced document might delay a release. A correctly filed note might secure better provisions for someone whose family had sent payment. And while there was potential for misuse of authority, there was also room for small acts of fairness, especially from clerks who valued accurate record-keeping as part of their professional identity. But beyond guards and officials, there were others whose presence shaped this underground world in more indirect ways. Tradespeople who brought supplies, carriers who delivered water or torches, priests who descended occasionally to offer counsel, visitors who were granted brief moments with loved ones under strict supervision. Each person who walked these corridors contributed, even unconsciously, to the atmosphere of the place. To understand a medieval dungeon fully, you must imagine not only the physical structure but the steady flow of people whose lives intersected with it. Not all of them left impressions on the historical record, but their footsteps, voices, and decisions filled the air of these spaces just as surely as the scent of damp stone. Each new pair of hands and each new set of eyes added another layer to an already complex environment. A dungeon was never just a room or a passageway. It was a meeting point of bureaucracy, labor, fear, resilience, and human imperfection, a subtle crossroads where medieval society revealed parts of itself that often went unseen. Even in a world of rigid hierarchies, where kings ruled kingdoms and peasants tilled fields, the dungeon sat at an unusual intersection. It reflected both the power of authority and the fragility of individuals caught in its grasp. It was a reminder that medieval life, for all its grandeur and pageantry, had shadows, and those shadows were inhabited not only by prisoners, but by the people tasked with maintaining the system that held them. And as we continue deeper, the stone walls begin to reveal something else, something quieter but no less powerful, the rhythm of daily life that persisted even in the depths. Even here, routines formed. Time passed, people adapted. Life, in its quiet, stubborn way, continued. Even in a place defined by confinement, a kind of daily rhythm emerged. Soft at first, almost invisible, but gradually shaping every hour beneath the stone. Medieval dungeons did not operate with the precise schedules of modern institutions. There were no clocks on walls, no bells signaling each hour, yet patterns formed, influenced by the habits of guards, the needs of the facility, and the slow turning of seasons above. The earliest part of the day often arrived not with light, but with sound. Somewhere far above, a gate might open, allowing a rush of distant noise to filter down, vendors calling to early customers, a wagon rolling over cobblestones, or footsteps echoing in a courtyard. These faint signals seeped through ventilation shafts like threads connecting the underground world to the morning life of the castle. For prisoners, the change was subtle. The air might shift slightly as cooler morning breeze passed through cracks in stone. The murmur of guards beginning their rounds would drift down the corridor. And for some, this was the closest sensation to morning they would experience. Meals, though sparse and simple, marked the passage of time more clearly than the cycles of light. A guard might arrive with coarse bread still firm from yesterday's baking, or with a ladle of warm broth accompanied by the faint aroma of herbs. It wasn't the food itself that mattered so much as the knowledge that another period of waiting had ended. Another small marker in a day that had few distinguishing features. The activity of the dungeon increased gradually as the castle awakened. Footsteps became more frequent in the corridor above. A distant conversation between guards might drift through the heavy door of a cell. Occasionally, the echo of a gate being unbarred could be heard, followed by voices too muffled to fully understand. These small noises, often ignored by those passing through, became the primary indicators of the changing world outside. Yet there were long hours of quiet, periods when sound seemed to disappear entirely. In those hours, the stillness of the dungeon became almost absolute, a silence that settled not just around the prisoners but within them. It was during these quiet stretches that time lost its familiar shape. Minutes felt as long as hours. A single drop of water from the ceiling, falling at irregular intervals, could become a kind of companion, an anchor in a place where so little changed. Temperature played its own role in marking the day. The dungeon held a steady coolness, but the air might grow slightly warmer as the castle above absorbed sunlight, or slightly colder as night fell. These shifts were delicate, perceptible only to those who had adapted to this environment with sharpened senses. Someone who had spent months or years underground could detect the transition of afternoon simply by the faint decrease in airflow through a shaft. The emotional weight of this environment was profound. Humans were not made to live without variation, without sunlight, without the vibrant cues that normally define each day. Over time, the mind responded in subtle ways. Memories blurred, not from trauma but from monotony. Past days blended into one another until the only clear markers were the occasional events. A visitor, a hearing, a change in guard shifts. And yet, people found ways to maintain a sense of identity. A prisoner might recite prayers, not just from faith, but to impose structure on the drifting hours. Someone else might hum softly, repeating the same melody learned in childhood, a melody that helped them measure time in ways no clock could. Others traced shapes on the floor or counted breaths to keep their thoughts steady. Even guards experienced their own rhythms. After long shifts, they learned to anticipate the cool drafts from certain corridors, the stiffness of hinges that needed repair, the moments when their own footsteps sounded too loud against the stone. Their routines became intertwined with the physical environment in a way that shaped their perception of the dungeon far more deeply than official duties did. As the day progressed, the castle above grew busier. Visitors arrived. Messengers passed through. Craftsmen delivered goods or made repairs. These activities reached the dungeon only as echoes, but they served as constant reminders that life elsewhere continued with all its color and motion. For prisoners who had spent long years underground, the sound of laughter drifting down a corridor could evoke a rhythm they had nearly forgotten, the pattern of ordinary life. Evening brought a slow quieting. Guards' footsteps changed as shifts ended. The castle's activity softened, replaced by the occasional clatter of a door being secured for the night. The dungeon responded to this change with a deeper stillness, and the air seemed to grow heavier as the absence of movement settled around the stone. Night was the most ambiguous time of all. Without light, without sound, without even the small variations of daytime airflow, the dungeon slipped into a silence that felt timeless. Hours passed unnoticed. For some prisoners, this was the most difficult stretch, when thoughts became louder than the world around them, and memory filled the space left by sensory quiet. Yet even in darkness, the dungeon possessed a kind of fragile order. It survived not through chaos but through these quiet, repeating patterns. Through the steady drip of water, the faint hum of distant life above, the soft shuffle of a guard making sure everything remained intact. Day after day, year after year, this rhythm shaped the lives of everyone who passed through these corridors. Castle garrisons changed, political tides shifted, monarchs rose and fell, but the dungeon remained steadfast, its routines continuing regardless of who occupied its cells or who commanded its gates. And within that rhythm, something surprising emerges, a sense of the medieval world that is quieter, more human, and more complex than the legends of cruelty or fear. A world where resilience grew in the dark, where ordinary people, guards, clerks, prisoners, each contributed to a daily life that, while difficult, never truly stopped. Because even here, at the lowest level of the castle, the human spirit found ways to endure. As the hours of night settled fully into the dungeon, the atmosphere changed in ways that were almost imperceptible at first. The air, already cool, grew slightly heavier, as if the very stones absorbed the silence from above. The faint vibrations caused by footsteps, voices, and movement in the castle faded to almost nothing. What remained were the sounds that belonged entirely to the underground world itself. The quiet drip of water finding its way through ancient mortar. The soft rustle of straw as a prisoner shifted to find a more comfortable position. The distant hum of wind moving through narrow ventilation shafts. Night in a medieval dungeon was uniquely still. Even the guards spoke less, their voices muted by the natural softening that comes when darkness falls. Their lanterns cast warm glows that moved slowly across stone corridors, creating arcs of light that slid over iron bars before disappearing again. For prisoners, this glow was sometimes the only change in the sensory landscape, a fleeting, gentle reminder that humanity still existed somewhere nearby. Yet darkness brought a different kind of clarity. Without distractions, people began to notice the small details of their surroundings with heightened awareness. The way moisture collected along the ceiling, forming droplets that shimmered faintly in lantern light. The subtle temperature shifts that came as cooler outside air filtered downward. The mild scent of earthiness that seemed stronger at night when the air grew still. Some prisoners would close their eyes, not for sleep, but to focus on memories that felt more vivid in the quiet. Faces of family members, scenes from childhood, the warmth of sunlight on open fields, the memory of a bustling marketplace filled with color and sound. These recollections, whether comforting or bittersweet, helped shape the quiet hours into something more bearable. Others maintained their connection to the world above through silent rituals. A whispered prayer spoken not in desperation, but as a way of marking time. A short phrase repeated like a meditation to keep thoughts steady. Even simple breathing patterns became forms of grounding. Slow inhales, slow exhales, creating rhythm where none existed. Guards, too, felt the weight of night differently than the day. They became more conscious of their responsibility, knowing the dungeon relied entirely on them during these hours. Their footsteps took on a measured cadence as they made their rounds, touching the cold metal of door hinges to ensure they were secure, pausing briefly at each cell to listen for signs that everything was as it should be. The nighttime guard role was less about authority and more about maintaining fragile stability in a place where silence could otherwise grow overwhelming. It was during the night that the architecture of the dungeon revealed its quiet brilliance. Medieval builders designed underground spaces with surprising care. The curvature of the ceiling helped redistribute weight from the castle above, creating a sense of shelter even in confinement. Drainage channels were carved with subtle angles that guided incoming water toward lower chambers, preventing flooding in cells. Ventilation shafts, though narrow, were aligned carefully to allow slow but steady air movement. These engineering choices softened the harshness of the environment, preserving a kind of equilibrium that made long-term survival possible. As the deepest hours of night passed, some prisoners fell asleep, not from comfort but from the exhaustion that comes with long days of waiting, hoping, and thinking. Sleep in a dungeon was light and easily disturbed. The sound of a guard adjusting his lantern, a distant metal clank, the soft groaning of wood expanding or contracting with temperature changes, yet even fragmented rest allowed people to face the next day with a touch more clarity. Eventually, faint signs of morning began to return. Not with sunrise, most prisoners wouldn't see natural light at all, but with subtle shifts in sound and airflow. The rumble of carts entering the castle courtyard, the call of someone beginning their work above, the soft clatter of doors in the distance being opened for the day's tasks. For prisoners, these were gentle reminders that the world of daylight continued, even if they could not witness it directly. That contrast between the quiet depths and the bustling life above shaped the entire dungeon experience. It created a layered sense of time, one that moved slowly underground but rushed ahead in the world outside. Days passed differently depending on where you stood, and those transitions between night and day emphasized the strange paradox of dungeon life. Confined yet never static, silent yet full of subtle movement, cut off yet still connected by echoes of a world that lived on. And through this rhythm, prisoners and guards alike discovered something essential about the medieval experience of confinement. Not simply the hardship, but the quiet endurance that filled every hour. The way the human mind adapted to darkness, the way people created meaning in the smallest shifts of sound or temperature, the resilience that emerged not from dramatic events, but from navigating a world shaped by stone, silence, and the slow turning of unseen seasons. The dungeon, for all its challenges, revealed layers of medieval life that rarely appear in chronicles or legends. It was not only a place of punishment, but a place where daily human experience unfolded quietly, shaped by architecture, routine, and the steady pulse of time moving just beyond reach. As morning fully settled into the upper levels of the fortress, the dungeon received its own version of dawn, one composed not of sunlight, but of human presence returning to the world above. Guards began their daily routines with a soft familiarity that said they had walked these same corridors countless times. Their footsteps carried a slightly brighter cadence than during their night rounds, as if daylight above lent them a touch more energy. The echo of leather boots against stone traveled ahead of them, announcing the start of another day. The first task each morning was to check the structural conditions of the underground chambers. Medieval builders understood that moisture, shifting earth, and temperature differences could subtly affect the stability of stonework. Guards would pause at certain points, pressing their palms against walls to feel for unusual dampness or warmth. Sometimes they tapped lightly with wooden handles to listen for changes in resonance, a time-tested method of checking whether mortar had weakened overnight. These small acts of care maintained the integrity of places designed to last centuries. A dungeon morning had a quiet rhythm of its own. Ventilation shafts carried downward the faint aroma of bread baking somewhere in the castle kitchens. To someone underground, that scent might drift in as a vague, comforting warmth, a reminder that ordinary life continued above, filled with routines utterly different from those of the dungeon. Occasionally, the distant sound of a cartwheel or a stable hand calling to horses would filter through, softened almost beyond recognition by its descent through walls and corridors. These small sensory intrusions helped prisoners orient themselves, offering tiny glimpses of a world that still turned. Guards often used the early hours to update their records. Medieval documentation was more detailed than many assume. Ledgers noting prisoner arrival dates, fees owed, special instructions from lords or magistrates, even occasional notes on behavior or health. Some guards took quiet pride in their handwriting, shaping careful lettering under the glow of lanterns as they worked at simple wooden desks placed in alcoves. Their work brought a degree of order to an environment defined by stone and silence. For prisoners, the morning brought a different set of sensations. The air, always cool, felt slightly fresher after a night of stillness. The subtle shift in airflow suggested that new currents had begun moving through the ventilation system, stirred by the activity above. Some prisoners sat upright, stretching limbs that had grown stiff during rest. Stretching was both a physical necessity and a mental ritual, a way to greet the new day, even in confinement. A small number of prisoners kept their own mental routines for mornings. Someone might trace a small symbol on the ground, a gesture inherited from a family tradition or religious practice. Another might quietly rehearse a list of memories, a technique to keep the mind anchored. Someone else might hum a barely audible tune remembered from childhood, letting the notes vibrate softly against the stone. These rituals were simple yet meaningful, creating continuity from day to day. Guards sometimes exchanged a few words with prisoners during morning rounds. Not conversations in the usual sense, but short acknowledgments, checking whether someone needed water, asking if the night passed without trouble, ensuring that no one appeared unwell. These brief interactions helped maintain a sense of humanity within an environment that might otherwise feel detached from the world. As the morning deepened, soft rays of indirect light would sometimes touch the uppermost parts of the dungeon through angled passageways. These were not beams of sunlight, but reflections, light bouncing off stone corridors before making its way into the deeper spaces. Yet, even these faint glimmers could shift the atmosphere noticeably, brightening the rough textures of the walls and giving them subtle color variations. Stone that looked uniformly gray at night revealed hints of brown, green, or muted ochre in this gentle reflected light. These spaces were not designed for beauty, yet their architecture created moments of quiet elegance. The curvature of archways framed the reflected light in soft shapes. Moisture on the walls caught the light and turned it into tiny shining beads. Even the iron fixtures, Rings, hinges, brackets took on warm highlights when touched by the faint glow. For the prisoners, these glimmers served as a reference point for internal timekeeping. Without windows or clocks, people relied on the natural rhythms of light, sound, and airflow to mark the passage of hours. Over days, months, and sometimes years, these small environmental clues became deeply familiar. A prisoner could often tell roughly what time it was purely by the tone of distant footsteps, the angle of reflected light, or the smell of activities in the castle above. Despite the constraints and hardships, the dungeon was not a place devoid of meaning. Human minds filled the space with memory, imagination, and subtle interpretation. People noticed patterns in the dripping of water, creating stories around the rhythm. They listened to the distant sounds of daily labor and imagined the scenes unfolding above. They traced shapes in the texture of the stone, finding symbols, animals, or patterns that resembled landscapes or constellations. In these quiet acts, they carved small pockets of humanity within a world defined by confinement. Meanwhile, the guards continued their morning duties with practiced efficiency. They replaced burned-out lanterns with freshly filled ones, their new flames casting steadier light along the corridors. They checked the locks with deliberate care, ensuring mechanisms worked smoothly. They inspected the drainage channels, clearing away bits of debris that had accumulated overnight. The maintenance routines were not just tasks. They were essential for keeping the dungeon functional and preventing the slow deterioration that could compromise safety. As the morning transitioned into midday, the dungeon settled again into its characteristic equilibrium. The air retained its cool steadiness. The stone absorbed the quiet activity and held it with stoic patience. Time continued its slow, layered movement, different above ground, different below, yet always progressing. In this balance of architecture, human presence, and the quiet persistence of natural forces, a medieval dungeon revealed its full complexity. It was a place shaped by careful engineering, sustained by routine, and inhabited by people navigating the intersection of hardship and endurance. And through all of it, morning, midday, night, the dungeon remained a space that demanded resilience, observation, and a quiet kind of strength from everyone within it. By the time midday settled fully across the castle grounds, the dungeon had entered one of its most distinctive phases, a quiet period where external activity softened, and the underground spaces felt almost suspended in time. The faint sounds that drifted downward during morning hours grew more distant. Above, people were busy with their daily responsibilities, but the rhythms of that work rarely reached the deepest chambers. This stillness was not empty. It had its own presence, a kind of calm density that accumulated between the stones. The temperature remained steady, insulated from the warmth rising outside. Air moved gently through narrow passageways, creating soft currents that brushed against the walls and stirred the flames of lanterns into slow, wavering patterns. These subtle shifts in light created an ever-changing interplay of brightness and shadow, as if the dungeon were breathing in long, measured intervals. For guards stationed below, midday brought a brief moment of personal ease. They sometimes leaned quietly against the stone, resting their weight for a moment before resuming their rounds. Their armor settled with a soft clink, echoing faintly off the walls. Some guards exchanged a few muted words, barely above a whisper, respecting the acoustics of the space. They spoke about weather, harvests, or small incidents from the morning, ordinary topics that added touches of normality to an otherwise austere environment. In these moments, the humanity of the place revealed itself most clearly. Despite the dungeon's reputation in popular imagination, it was a workplace for many of the people who served there. They understood its architecture intimately, knowing which steps creaked slightly more than others, which corners held onto drafts, which lanterns burned a little too quickly. Generations of guards passed down their knowledge, creating a quiet lineage of familiarity within the stone. For prisoners, midday could be one of the most introspective times. With fewer external sounds to distract them, their attention often turned inward. Some meditated silently, focusing on their breathing or on memories from their earlier lives. Others recited stories, prayers, or cherished sayings under their breath, simple, grounding routines that helped maintain clarity of mind. A few observed the rhythm of droplets falling from ceiling arches into small puddles, using that cadence to mark time or calm racing thoughts. The human mind adapts in remarkable ways. Even in a place defined by confinement, people found patterns, rhythms, and structures to hold on to. A prisoner might listen closely to the gradual rise and fall of airflow from above, treating it as a signal of the passing hours. Another might study the dim reflection of light on the opposite wall and memorize how its angle changed through the day. Over time, these small observations became intimate companions, forming a personal relationship with the space itself. Meanwhile, above ground, the castle continued its bustle. Messages delivered, plans discussed, decisions issued. Some of those decisions directly affected the dungeon. Temporary holds authorized, documents processed, or instructions sent down with a simple wax seal pressed into parchment. When these messages arrived, they carried with them the weight of the world outside, reminding the underground chambers that they were part of a much larger system. Around early afternoon, a soft murmur sometimes rose through the passageways, carried by changing airflow. It wasn't distinguishable as speech, but felt like a distant tide of human activity. This subtle hum served as a reminder that life above continued in all its complexity. Markets, training yards, busy kitchens, open courtyards. The dungeon existed beneath these layers, connected through architecture yet separate in atmosphere. The stone itself seemed to respond to temperature changes above, expanding or contracting in ways too subtle to notice visually but sometimes audible as faint, quiet ticks. Medieval builders understood the nature of stone intimately, selecting materials that could endure these shifts without cracking. Their craftsmanship allowed these subterranean structures to withstand centuries of seasonal cycles, battles, and repairs. One fascinating feature of many dungeons was the existence of small maintenance niches, tiny recesses or alcoves used by masons and laborers during the original construction. Though most were empty, they carried a sense of the builder's presence. Marks left by chisels remained visible, and in some rare cases, stonecutters carved small initials or symbols near their working areas. To a trained observer, these details told a story about how the structure came into being, the tools used, the skills applied, the hands that shaped the space. As the afternoon progressed, the light reflecting into the dungeon shifted again. The faint golden tone from midday gradually cooled into a softer, paler hue. Shadows lengthened gracefully along the floor, stretching toward archways and pillars. The air remained cool, but the slight changes in color gave the impression of a world preparing to transition again. The dungeon existed in an almost meditative state, neither fully awake nor fully resting, but resting in its own timeless equilibrium. Prisoners could sense this shift even without seeing the sky. Their internal clocks, shaped by routine, sensory cues, and long observation, grew sharply attuned to these transitions. A well-trained ear could detect the difference between midday echoes and afternoon ones. Slight differences in the quality of sound, the softness of air, or the tone of voices from the upper halls signaled that the day was beginning its slow descent toward evening. The dungeon, in this way, became its own world with subtle seasons marked not by snow or rain, but by human movement, light reflections, airflow, and the breathing rhythm of stone. The deeper hours of afternoon approached gently, settling like a cool veil across the chambers. And as that veil descended, the spaces below prepared once again for the long journey into evening. As afternoon deepened, the dungeon entered one of its most atmospheric phases. The light from above, already faint by the time it reached these chambers, began to soften even further, turning the stone corridors into long gradients of muted gold and gray. Shadows pooled in the recesses between pillars, the cool air settled more firmly, creating a crisp stillness that felt almost ceremonial. For the guards, this period marked the beginning of subtle preparations. They checked lanterns, ensuring each wick had enough oil to last through the coming evening. The gentle scrape of metal lids lifting, the quiet clink of glass, and the soft glug of oil being poured formed a kind of low ritual. These sounds echoed through the corridors, weaving themselves naturally into the acoustic fabric of the space. Some guards adjusted their cloaks and settled their equipment more firmly at their sides. They understood the rhythm of the dungeon better than anyone. Evening hours brought changes in mood and atmosphere, nothing dramatic, but meaningful shifts that required attentiveness. The castle above would soon transition into its own nighttime routines, and that transformation rippled downward like a slow tide. Prisoners sensed it too. Even without a clock, without a window, without a direct view of the changing sky, they recognized the approach of evening through the body's innate intuition. The air felt subtly different, a bit denser, a bit cooler, a bit more settled. Footsteps from the upper levels grew more deliberate as the castle prepared for the evening meal. Distant voices changed tone, not louder or quieter, but carrying a different energy, as if the day itself were taking a long exhale. For some, this time became an opportunity for reflection. They replayed conversations from earlier in the day, considered decisions they had made, or simply stared into the soft glow of lanterns, letting their thoughts drift like dust motes suspended in the air. The quiet hum of the dungeon created a unique kind of privacy, a space where the mind wandered freely even when the body could not. The architecture played a role in shaping these emotional rhythms. Narrow corridors, thick walls, and arched ceilings created acoustics that captured sound gently, holding it close rather than letting it ring sharply. Even the faintest movement, linen shifting, water dripping, stone settling, carried a certain weight within the silence. Medieval builders understood that underground chambers required sturdiness above all, but they likely never imagined how their craftsmanship would influence the psychological atmosphere centuries later. In some castles, the late afternoon hours were when officials or record keepers occasionally descended to deliver or retrieve documents. Their steps were lighter than those of the guards, and they carried the faint scent of parchment and wax with them. These visits added a touch of administration to the dungeon's existence, reminding everyone below that this was not a forgotten place but a functioning element of the castle's complex system. The dungeon was not a realm of chaos. It operated with structure and purpose. People above handled disputes, issued orders, and determined timelines. People below enforced those decisions with a steady rhythm. This orderliness gave the dungeon a certain predictability, which, for many prisoners, provided a strange sense of stability. Fixed routines, meal times, checks, light adjustments helped anchor the mind to something concrete in a world defined by restriction. As daylight waned above, airflow patterns shifted once more. Cooler air slipped downward, moving through narrow shafts with a soft, almost soothing whisper. Lantern flames flickered in response, briefly stretching tall before returning to their steady glow. These small atmospheric changes signaled that evening was approaching with certainty. The dungeon responded not by growing more foreboding, but by becoming quieter and more introspective. It was a space that evolved with the passing hours, shaped by the breath of the castle, the heartbeat of human activity, and the timeless patience of stone walls that had stood for generations. Soon the castle bells above would signal the onset of evening, a long resonance that carried through every level of the fortress, and when those notes finally rolled down into the depths, the dungeon would shift once again, embracing the calm, contemplative hours of night. When the castle bells finally sounded, the deep resonant notes rolling through layers of stone, the dungeon shifted in a way that was almost ceremonial. The vibration traveled downward like a slow wave, brushing across the walls, the floors, the iron bars, and the lantern hooks. Even the air seemed to pause for a moment, acknowledging the transition. Evening had arrived. Above, the castle moved into its nightly routines, kitchens preparing the evening meal, guards rotating shifts, courtiers dimming hall torches and closing shutters against the cool wind. Down below, the dungeon mirrored this transition in its own quieter rhythm. Lanterns were checked once more. Their light deepened from pale gold to a warmer, softer glow. The steady flame gave the underground spaces a calmer atmosphere, less stark than midday, more intimate than morning. Shadows stretched a little longer across the stone floors, pooling in doorways and corners, shaping the dungeon into a place that felt both spacious and enclosed at the same time. Guards walked their rounds with slower, more measured steps. Evening shifts tended to be less hurried. There were fewer interruptions from above, fewer administrative summons, fewer unexpected visitors. The dungeon became something of a self-contained world during these hours, with its own pace and its own sense of time. Some guards used these quieter moments to lean briefly against a wall, listening to the muffled hum of the castle settling for the night. They adjusted the straps on their cloaks, ensuring warmth as the deeper chill descended. The temperature underground rarely changed dramatically, yet subtle variations were enough for experienced personnel to prepare for. Prisoners, too, felt the shift. Even without clocks, their bodies recognized the slower cadence of movement outside their chambers, the soft dimming of light, the way the dungeon's acoustics seemed to tighten. Evening brought a unique blend of stillness and reflection. Some sat quietly, preserving warmth. Others whispered to themselves or traced the contours of stone blocks with their fingertips, grounding their thoughts in something tactile and real. In certain castles, guards would open small hatches or barred slits to provide evening water rations. The sound of water being poured, steady, rhythmic, almost ceremonial, echoed softly from corridor to corridor. These practical moments, though simple, were grounding. They reminded everyone below that the dungeon was part of a functioning institution, not an abandoned space forgotten by time. Architecturally, the dungeon seemed to breathe differently during these hours. The arched ceilings caught lantern light in soft arcs, turning rough stone into surfaces that reflected warmth rather than absorbing it entirely. Airflow settled into a steady, quiet pattern, warmer currents rising subtly while cooler ones curled gently along the lower stones. Medieval builders may not have intended these atmospheric effects, yet their craftsmanship shaped them all the same. Evening also brought a psychological clarity. With the noise of daytime fading, thoughts moved more freely. Some prisoners replayed the events that led them here, not with panic but with a calm detachment that nighttime often inspires. Others drifted into contemplation about family, land, responsibilities, or distant memories, threads of life untouched by iron bars. The dungeon's silence became a canvas for private reflection. Guards, too, often grew introspective. They moved through their routines with practiced calm, lantern light brushing the edges of their armor. Many spent these hours not thinking about duties or schedules, but simply listening to the faint clink of metal, the distant murmur of the castle above, the quiet shifting of cloth, the occasional wind slipping through narrow ventilation shafts. This evening rhythm created something rare in the medieval world, a place where time felt slower, quieter, almost suspended. And as the sky above deepened into true night, the dungeon prepared to enter its most atmospheric phase, a period when light, temperature, and sound blended into a uniquely immersive stillness that defined life beneath the castle. Soon the long night would settle fully across the fortress, and the dungeon would shift once more into the quiet hours that shaped the inner world of everyone who lived or worked within it. Night settled over the castle like a heavy velvet curtain, blotting out the last traces of twilight. Above the dungeon, torches were extinguished one by one, windows shuttered against the cold, and the clatter of daily activity faded into a muted emptiness. The world upstairs fell quiet. Down in the dungeon, the change was far more subtle, but unmistakable. Lantern flames grew steadier now that the airflow had calmed. The golden light deepened into something warm, steady, and almost gentle, casting slow-moving shadows across the stone. The dungeon at night no longer felt like a place of hard lines and echoing corridors. It felt enclosed, insulated, and still. The air cooled slightly, not dramatically, but enough that breath came out a little thicker, and fingertips sensed the faint evening chill clinging to the lower stones. Guards adjusted their cloaks with quiet, deliberate movements. Their armor no longer clinked loudly. Instead, each shift of weight produced a muted, almost respectful sound in the calm around them. This was the hour when the dungeon became introspective. With fewer responsibilities tugging at them, the guards often allowed their minds to drift toward their own lives, families sleeping somewhere above, fields lying fallow beyond castle walls, memories of festivals or market days that felt impossibly far away from the underground quiet. In these moments, the dungeon felt less like a workplace and more like a world apart, one governed by its own sense of time. Prisoners, too, felt the weight of night. Some sat with their backs against cool stone, listening to the faint hum of lanterns and the steady rhythm of distant footsteps. Others curled beneath blankets or cloaks, conserving warmth. Their breathing mingled with the soft, ambient sounds of the dungeon. Steady, slow, almost meditative. Contrary to popular imagination, night in a medieval dungeon wasn't filled with dramatic cries or frantic noise. Most of the time it was astonishingly quiet. The thick architecture, the arches, the corridors, the layered stone, absorbed sound so effectively that even a whispered conversation in one cell often faded to silence before reaching the next. That softness made the environment strangely calming. Even the drip of water, steady and rhythmic, took on an almost musical quality in the quiet hours. The sound echoed gently along the curved walls, creating a kind of natural lullaby shaped entirely by stone and time. Some guards found comfort in this. During routine nighttime rounds, they walked at a slower pace, lanterns casting slow arcs of light across rough floors. Their path took them past supporting pillars, barred doorways, storage niches carved into walls, and narrow ventilation shafts breathing cool air into the space above their heads. Night guard duty wasn't a burden here. It was a ritual, a practiced series of movements performed in calm, methodical silence. Every castle had its own tradition for these hours. In some, guards made small notations on wooden boards marking the completion of each round. In others, a bell or small chime quietly acknowledged the time. And in a few particularly well-organized fortresses, guards exchanged brief written notes about observations. Nothing dramatic, just details. Lantern wick trimmed, air cooler in southern passage. No unusual noise. Tiny details that showed how much care went into running spaces most people never saw. As night deepened, the lantern glow seemed to warm the stone itself. Shadows stretched comfortably along the floors, shaping alcoves and niches into soft silhouettes. The dungeon became almost peaceful, a place where the relentless pace of life above slowed to a gentle heartbeat. This was the hour when the dungeon felt most like a world suspended between earth and time. A place where nothing rushed, nothing hurried, and everything simply existed. Soon the castle above would sink fully into sleep, and the dungeon would enter the quietest, slowest, most intimate part of the entire day, the deep night hours, when sound, memory, and atmosphere blended into a single, continuous stillness. Midnight arrived quietly in the dungeon. There was no bell to mark the hour, no grand announcement from above. Instead, the moment revealed itself in tiny changes, the air settling into a cooler, more even temperature, the last echoes from the upper floors fading entirely, and an unmistakable shift in the rhythm of the dungeon itself. This was when the dungeon felt almost weightless. Every lantern burned at its lowest, producing a steady amber glow with soft halos that floated around each flame. The light didn't push back the darkness sharply. Instead, it blended with it, creating an atmosphere that felt more like twilight than midnight. Shadows fell like soft folds of fabric, draping corners and archways in muted stillness. The stone, warmed slightly by hours of torchlight and human presence, held on to that warmth, but radiated nothing. It simply existed, cool, unmoving, ancient. Sound became rare. A guard's footsteps, earlier sharp against stone, were now absorbed by the environment until they were little more than a gentle pattern. Cloth shifting, metal brushing, a quiet exhale. These sounds floated in the air like faint brush strokes rather than interruptions. If someone dropped a key ring or metal cup, it would echo dramatically through the corridor, but such accidents rarely happened. Deep night created an unspoken etiquette of caution. Movement slowed. Hands held things more deliberately. Even voices, when necessary, softened to a calm, measured tone. The dungeon was not asleep. Stone does not sleep, but it held its breath. Above ground, the castle would be colder now, with fireplaces burning low and servants long since tucked into their quarters. But underground, beneath layers of stone and earth, the temperature remained astonishingly stable. This natural insulation meant that midnight in a dungeon often felt strangely consistent, cool, but not bitter, still, but not lifeless. For the prisoners who remained awake, this hour had its own meaning. Some people experience a strange second wind at night. The mind becomes sharper, thoughts more vivid, memories more alive. In the dungeon, this mental clarity often led prisoners to reflect deeply on their pasts. They replayed conversations, imagined paths not taken, remembered festivals, fields, smells of kitchens, details of ordinary life suddenly intensified by distance. The mind becomes a lantern of its own in the dark. Others drifted in and out of light sleep, not quite dreaming, not fully awake, caught in a gentle rhythm shaped by the low hum of the dungeon around them. Their bodies found pockets of warmth under blankets or cloaks, and the natural acoustic softness created a strangely soothing environment for rest. Even the guards eased into a steady cadence. Night shift guards weren't tense unless something unusual happened. The deep stillness gave them a clear sense of the entire space. They could tell if anything was off just by listening. One sound out of place would stand out immediately. They walked their routes with practiced calm, lanterns glowing in slow arcs as they passed pillars and gated alcoves. They paused at checkpoints, sometimes resting a hand against the cool stone or adjusting their gear. It wasn't relaxation exactly, but a quiet familiarity, a kind of relationship with the dungeon built over countless nights. These guards often knew the dungeon better than any architect. They knew where the air moved most gently, where echoes were strongest, where a lantern flickered every night around the same hour because of a hidden draft. They knew the moods of the dungeon, how it sounded on rainy nights, how it felt in winter, how shadows shifted differently in summer. Deep night revealed these subtle truths. At this hour, the dungeon almost felt like a world outside of time, like the rest of the castle, the fields beyond. The entire medieval world had withdrawn into sleep, leaving only this quiet chamber of stone and light behind. There was no urgency, no distraction, no movement except what needed to happen. Everything simply existed in a state of complete, uninterrupted stillness. But this calm wouldn't last forever. Soon, another small but unmistakable transition would begin. The gradual shift toward dawn, when the dungeon would stir again and the cycle would begin anew. The first sign of dawn inside a medieval dungeon was never light. There were no windows for sunlight to slip through, no sky to blush with early color. Down here, the sun might as well have been a story someone once told. So the dungeon learned to measure mornings through different signals, small, nearly invisible changes that, once you understood them, became unmistakable. It always started with sound, not loud sounds, not even deliberate ones, but subtle shifts, the kind that enter the mind before the ears fully recognize them. Somewhere far above, in the floors where servants lived and worked, the earliest morning tasks would begin. A wooden door opened softly. A bucket was set down. Someone walked across old boards. These faint vibrations traveled through the stone in a muted, resonant way, becoming gentle tremors that drifted downward like distant thunder softened by layers of earth. The dungeon responded with its own quiet reaction. The air felt different, very slightly cooler, but also thinner, touched by the faintest movement. It wasn't real ventilation in the modern sense, but a shift in pressure caused by the world above beginning its day. The stone released a bit of the heat it had held during the night, and the environment settled into a more neutral tone, preparing for the activity to come. Lantern flames flickered longer, leaning subtly toward drafts. Shadows lengthened in slow motion, stretching across the floor in diagonal patterns. For the guards, this was the hour of internal recalibration. Naturally, the human body knows when a night shift nears its end. Eyes grow a little heavier. Footsteps lose their earlier precision. But the mind becomes oddly alert in anticipation of transition. Guards would check their lantern oil, adjust their belts, or pause briefly at posts in a quiet ritual of mental preparation. Some might stretch their hands near a torch to recapture warmth. Others leaned gently against a wall, never enough to rest, just enough to feel the stone's grounding presence through their armor. The dungeon's architecture guided this entire process. Many medieval dungeons were designed with narrow ventilation shafts or upward channels carved through walls and ceilings. These weren't luxuries. They were engineering necessities, ensuring the dungeon didn't grow stale to the point of danger. Through these small openings, even the faintest environmental changes moved through the structure. As dawn neared, those channels carried the slightest hints of above-ground atmosphere, cleaner, fresher, touched by early morning humidity. The difference was tiny, so small that a visitor might not notice it at all. But a long-term prisoner or a guard who'd spent years in this place could sense it instantly. This was the moment when many prisoners stirred, not because they knew it was morning, but because the human body, even without sunlight, can feel environmental rhythm. Some shifted beneath blankets, finding new positions. Others blinked awake slowly, unsure whether minutes or hours had passed. A few experienced a temporary clarity, the kind that happens after a long night when the mind rises before the body fully follows. Some prisoners whispered quiet prayers, using the early hour to ground themselves. Others simply observed the space around them, appreciating the stillness before the full day began. This twilight period inside the dungeon, the hour before dawn that never sees dawn, was surprisingly calm, almost peaceful. a moment suspended between night's deep silence and the duties that daytime would demand. It was the closest the dungeon ever came to breathing. And as this transition grew clearer, a single sound would eventually break the stillness fully. The approach of daytime guards, their armor softly shifting as they entered the lower levels. That sound marked the end of night in the dungeon. The day didn't begin with sunlight down here. It began with keys. Before you ever heard footsteps, before voices echoed through the hallway, there was that distinct metallic sound, the gentle clinking of several iron keys swaying together as a guard descended the stairwell. It was subtle at first, like something brushing against armor, but unmistakable once you learned its rhythm. The keys signaled authority. They signaled routine, and they signaled that whatever few hours of fragile stillness existed overnight were now over. The guards moved deliberately, boots striking stone with a practiced pace. Their lanterns threw shifting shapes across the walls, tall, thin silhouettes that stretched and contracted as they walked, giving the hallway a soft, wavering glow. For the prisoners, this was the moment when vague morning awareness became something concrete. Even those who hadn't slept stirred at the sound. A few sat up slowly, backs stiff from the cold. Others rubbed their arms for warmth, or simply listened, waiting to understand what kind of day this might become. Medieval dungeons had routines, even if they weren't as structured as modern institutions. Much of it depended on the governor, the guards on duty, the castle's needs, or even the season. But one element was nearly universal: the morning check. The guards rarely spoke during these early rounds. Silence made the process faster and safer. Conversation wasn't necessary. Instead, they moved from cell to cell, lanterns raised, scanning each space with practiced eyes. They weren't checking for escape attempts, not usually, but for signs that required immediate attention. A prisoner who had fallen ill, someone who hadn't moved since last night, a broken chain, a section of damp wall that needed repair, a bucket needing replacement. Each of these details mattered because the dungeon, despite being associated with neglect, was ultimately an instrument of order. Disorder, even small disorder, could ripple outward into problems. And so the morning round was quiet, efficient, almost methodical. You could hear the lantern hooks being adjusted as guards leaned them forward. You could hear the slight shift of armor as a guard crouched to inspect something. You could hear water dripping from the ceiling as the dungeon warmed by a fraction of a degree. Once the check was complete, the day's rhythm fully activated. A wooden hatch would open above, usually connected to a service hallway used by castle staff. A bucket of water descended on a rope. Sometimes it was fresh, sometimes not, depending on many factors. The weather, the well levels, who had handled the task, or simply the priorities of the household that day. Food followed. It wasn't a feast. It wasn't even a meal in the modern sense. But it was the morning ration, a piece of bread, thicker on good days, thinner when resources were strained. Sometimes a small ladle of broth. Sometimes nothing more than a handful of grains softened overnight. Prisoners understood the ration system instinctively. You didn't complain. You didn't ask for more. You simply received what arrived and made it last as best you could. Meanwhile, the dungeon as a physical structure was slowly waking too. Stone walls cracked faintly as they expanded from the night's cold. Moisture dripped more steadily as the air warmed. Dust, disturbed by activity from above, drifted downward in soft spirals. The faint smell of morning cooking fires, bread, smoke, herbs, filtered in through ventilation shafts, a reminder that an entirely different world existed only a few floors away. Some prisoners paused when they sensed that smell. Not out of longing, but because it reminded them that time was still moving, even here. Guards, now more alert after the initial check, sometimes shifted into quiet conversation. Not about prisoners, rarely that, but about weather, assignments, who had the next watch, or small events happening in the castle courtyard above. Their words echoed softly through corridors, blending with the dungeon's natural acoustics in a way that made every conversation feel strangely distant. The morning hour was also when certain administrative tasks began. A scribe might arrive with a small writing board to check names or note condition reports. A messenger from the castle lord could descend to inquire about a specific prisoner. Occasionally, coins exchanged hands when families had delivered payments the night before. This early cycle of routine gave structure to a place that otherwise existed outside time. Inside the dungeon, days didn't change much, but mornings always marked a transition, a psychological boundary, a reminder that the dungeon wasn't simply a void of darkness. It was part of a functioning medieval system, and once these rituals were complete, the dungeon settled into its daytime state, quieter, more predictable, but never fully peaceful. It was a world that never slept, only shifted between degrees of silence. Daytime inside a medieval dungeon was an experience unlike anything above ground. It didn't feel like day. It didn't feel like night. It felt like a long, stretched-out pause in time, an in-between state where the world continued moving overhead, but nothing inside these walls moved unless it had to. Once the morning routine settled, the guards withdrew into a more distant presence. Their footsteps faded into upper corridors, their lantern light receded, and the dungeon returned to its natural state of muted stillness. This was the time when prisoners became acutely aware of just how slow a day could feel. When you remove sunlight, clocks, conversation, and stimulation, the human brain has very few ways to measure time. Minutes become fluid, hours blend together. A whole afternoon could feel like a week, or it could feel like nothing at all. Many prisoners describe this sensation, when they had the chance to speak about it later, as one of the most disorienting aspects of dungeon life. Down here, the absence of events became the event. The droplets of water striking stone floors echoed more clearly, forming their own rhythmic pattern. The distant movement of staff somewhere above, barely audible, seemed magnified, the vibrations carrying through stone beams. Even the sound of your own breathing, or the way your heartbeat echoed in your ears, became strangely loud when everything else was silent. Some prisoners tried to occupy their minds by replaying memories. A childhood afternoon, a conversation from years ago, the face of someone they missed. Anything that offered even a temporary escape. Others focused on small tasks, counting breaths, tracing patterns in the dirt, stretching stiff limbs, rearranging straw on the floor. These weren't hobbies. They were survival mechanisms. In conditions where nothing happened, you had to create your own markers of time or risk losing any sense of continuity. The dungeon environment shifted subtly throughout these hours. The air grew thicker as humidity climbed. Condensation gathered on walls, eventually dripping in irregular patterns. Shadows shifted as the lanterns above were moved or extinguished. Occasionally, dust from the upper floors drifted down shafts, forming thin layers on the floor. And always there was the cold. Not the sharp, biting cold of winter winds, but that deep, steady chill carried by stone, an unchanging cold that seeped slowly through skin and into bone. Prisoners wrapped their arms around themselves or curled inward, trying to preserve body heat. Even those shackled to walls learned to shift their weight strategically to stop shivering for a few fleeting moments. If a prisoner shared the space with others, the daytime hours shaped the dynamics between them. Groups formed quiet understandings. Some whispered to each other, carefully, conservatively, sharing stories or simply acknowledging one another's presence. Others kept to themselves, too guarded or too exhausted to speak. Tensions could flare as well. The silence amplified irritation. Small disagreements over space, food crumbs, or posture became significant. In the monotony, everything felt bigger, heavier, more personal. Meanwhile, guards sometimes passed through the hallway, not to speak, not to interact, but to maintain presence. Their armor clinked lightly as they walked. The iron keys swayed again. A lantern beam swept across the cells like a thin golden line before disappearing just as quickly. These brief intrusions reminded prisoners of two things simultaneously: that they were not forgotten and that they had no control over anything. This was perhaps the cruelest paradox of dungeon days. Time passed agonizingly slowly for the prisoners, but they had no power to influence it, no tasks, no obligations, no choices. Time wasn't theirs, it simply happened to them. Occasionally, an administrative event interrupted the monotony. A messenger might arrive with questions, a scribe might update a record, a priest might descend with soft footsteps and a low voice. Each visit had a different purpose, but all created a ripple of anxiety, because change, any change, was unpredictable in a place governed by silence. Food didn't arrive again until much later, and even then it wasn't always timely. So during these slow hours, hunger crept in steadily. It was a quiet hunger, not dramatic or overwhelming, but persistent, like a small weight pressing on the stomach throughout the day. By midday, the dungeon felt separated from reality entirely. You couldn't feel the sun. You couldn't know if clouds hung overhead or if the sky was clear. You couldn't sense the heat or the breeze. You lived in a suspended world of stone, dampness, and stillness where each passing hour left no trace behind it. Some prisoners tried to sleep through the day. Others couldn't sleep even if exhausted. The silence was too heavy, the floor too uncomfortable, the cold too intrusive. And through all of this, the dungeon itself seemed alive in a slow, geological way. Walls settled, beams creaked faintly, water traveled through channels carved centuries earlier, the space breathed in its own strange way. By the time afternoon faded, if one could even sense such a thing, many prisoners felt mentally drained despite having done nothing at all. The slow hours weren't restful. They were emotionally exhausting, stretching the mind in ways humans weren't designed to endure. But as the day slowly began its shift toward evening, prisoners knew the quiet wouldn't last forever. Night brought different sounds, different dangers, different rhythms. And when the lanterns above began to glow a little warmer, signaling the approach of those later hours, the dungeon prepared to change once again. Nightfall inside a medieval dungeon didn't happen the way it did above ground. There was no sunset, no fading orange light, no gradual darkening. There was just a subtle shift. So subtle you might miss it if you weren't paying attention. A guard's lantern dimmed slightly. A corridor became quieter. A distant hallway door was shut for the evening. Air currents slowed almost imperceptibly. And that was enough to change the entire atmosphere. Night inside a dungeon wasn't darker, it was heavier. It settled on prisoners like a thick blanket of uncertainty. The sounds changed first. Above-ground activity faded as castle residents retired for the evening. The blacksmith's hammer fell silent. The courtyard emptied. Merchants and visitors were gone. Even guards changed shifts, leaving long intervals where footsteps were rare. These gaps in sound created an eerie stillness. Prisoners held their breath without meaning to, listening for something, anything, that reminded them the world continued moving. But the dungeon swallowed noise more than it produced it. Sometimes the only sounds were the slow drip of water, the rustle of straw beneath a shifting prisoner, a quiet exhale from someone trying to fall asleep, or the distant, muffled clatter of a chain settling into a new shape. If you listened closely, you could hear stone itself, expanding as temperatures dropped, contracting in other places. The floor beneath your feet carried faint vibrations from the structure adjusting, almost like the dungeon had its own pulse. Night also reshaped the air. It became colder, noticeably colder, and somehow more stagnant. You could almost taste the dampness, a mineral-heavy coolness that settled in your lungs and lingered there. For some prisoners, nights were the hardest time. The brain, deprived of stimulation all day, became hyperactive when left alone in the dark. Thoughts grew louder, fears magnified, regrets replayed themselves. The absence of sensory input meant the mind filled the void with whatever it could find. A prisoner who was calm during the day might feel their heartbeat race at night. Another who conserved strength might suddenly feel compelled to pace if they weren't chained. Someone who hadn't spoken in days might whisper into the darkness just to hear their own voice, to confirm they still existed. If a cell contained multiple prisoners, this was when the group dynamic shifted most dramatically. Some huddled for warmth. Some whispered stories or prayers. Others turned inward, becoming silent for hours. Occasionally, a prisoner would wake from a half-dream and mistake shadows on the wall for movement. The mind, deprived of reference points, began to create its own. This wasn't delusion. It was the brain's attempt to anchor itself. Night was also when fear of the unknown intensified. Prisoners never knew who might approach after dark. A guard performing a late patrol, a messenger coming with orders, a priest seeking someone specifically, or no one at all, which was sometimes the most unnerving possibility. The unpredictability made every small sound feel significant. A soft knock of stone, a rat, a guard, a prisoner shifting in the next cell, a loose iron ring settling in its bolt, or simply the dungeon breathing again. For prisoners awaiting judgment, night was when imagination became the harshest. Questions filled the darkness. Would tomorrow bring news? Would a visitor come? Would their case be forgotten? Would freedom arrive or sentencing? Time felt different during these hours. The already slow pace of the day somehow slowed further, stretching long, thin, and almost translucent. You couldn't measure it. You couldn't predict it. All you could do was endure it. Some prisoners tried to sleep, others couldn't. Sleep was unpredictable, sometimes arriving suddenly, sometimes never arriving at all. And then, in the oddest way, the dungeon seemed to settle into a quiet synchronization, like everything was holding breath at the same time. Stone walls absorbed warmth from bodies and lanterns. Air thickened, silence grew, even footsteps overhead became rare. This was the deep night, the dungeon's most introspective hour, when the world above truly slept and the world below hovered in a timeless state that felt neither alive nor dead. When morning eventually returned, signaled again not by sunlight but by distant movement, prisoners often felt as if an entire lifetime had passed in the night. But nothing had changed. They were still in the same place, still waiting, still listening, still enduring. If nights inside a medieval dungeon revealed the emotional landscape of imprisonment, then food and water revealed everything about the physical one. They were the rhythm, the currency, and sometimes the only markers of passing time. Meals didn't arrive on a schedule the way they do today. They arrived when someone remembered, or when someone had time, or when someone had reason to be generous, or strict. A prisoner might hear footsteps echoing down a hallway and wonder whether it was time for food or simply a guard passing through. Sometimes, days felt long enough that prisoners believed they'd been forgotten, only to hear a latch click and a small bowl push through an opening moments later. The food itself was simple to the point of invisibility. Bread often coarse and dry by the time it reached the dungeon. Thin broth, occasional vegetables, usually the ones that couldn't be sold elsewhere. Sometimes barley mixed with water, sometimes nothing at all. Bread was the most common item. Hard, dense, and barely seasoned, it absorbed the surrounding dampness almost immediately. Prisoners tore pieces slowly, both to make the portion last, and because eating quickly was pointless when you were trying to maintain strength rather than satisfy hunger. The broth was often lukewarm, the heat lost halfway between the kitchen and the dungeon. It wasn't unpleasant, it was simply thin, more liquid than substance, but warm enough to bring brief comfort to hands chilled by stone walls. Water was its own uncertainty. Rainwater collected in barrels during storms. Well water was carried down in heavy buckets, the ropes squeaking with each pull. Sometimes water came straight from underground channels that ran beneath the castle, filtered naturally through layers of soil and stone. It wasn't refreshing water exactly, it tasted of the earth. Mineral heavy, cold enough to numb the tongue at first sip, sometimes slightly metallic. But it was water, and that alone made it precious. Prisoners learned quickly that water was more important than food. You could feel hunger and survive it, but thirst made the hours longer, the air thicker, the mind more frantic. Most prisoners drank slowly, conserving each sip. Others drank quickly, needing the relief immediately, even if it meant the next hours would be harder. The bowls and cups were simple, usually wood. They absorbed the moisture around them, swelling slightly over time, darkening with use. The edges softened from repeated handling. They were light enough to be easy to carry, heavy enough to feel real in a place where so little else felt tangible. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was communication. A smaller portion than usual meant something. Sometimes it meant resources were low. Sometimes it meant a prisoner's status had changed. Sometimes it meant nothing more than that a guard had been distracted. But prisoners rarely interpreted it as random. They were too hungry to think that way. They searched for meaning wherever they could find it. Occasionally, a guard would linger for a moment while delivering food, offering a brief nod, a word, or even silence that carried a certain gentleness. That small gesture could shift a prisoner's outlook for an entire day. Food could also be traded, not formally, but through quiet arrangements. A prisoner with family who brought occasional items might trade a small piece of bread for help, information, or simple companionship. A prisoner who had learned to read might trade that skill to someone who couldn't. The smallest resources became part of a quiet economy, measured not in coins but in trust, obligation, and shared suffering. Occasionally, a feast in the castle above created a rare moment of surprise below. Leftovers, not the elaborate dishes but the simplest scraps, might make their way down. A slice of softer bread, a piece of fruit, a vegetable from a stew. Moments like that felt almost unreal, reminding prisoners that the world above followed rhythms of celebration they no longer belonged to. And then there were days when no food came. Not as punishment, not as neglect, but simply because medieval life was unpredictable. Storms, festivals, unexpected demands on the castle's staff, any of these could disrupt the flow of meals to the dungeon. Prisoners endured these days quietly, focusing on conserving strength and waiting for normalcy to resume. Some dungeons had a single water source, a small trough or cistern carved directly into the stone. It filled slowly through underground seepage, giving prisoners a limited supply that was cold year-round. The sound of drops hitting the surface became familiar, almost comforting. Food and water shaped everything, not because they were plentiful, but because they were just enough to remind prisoners that survival continued. Slowly, quietly, in ways that required patience rather than resistance. Meals weren't moments of satisfaction. They were reminders that life persisted, even without comfort, that the body adapted, even when conditions didn't, and that prisoners, despite the environment, held on to routines that grounded them. In the end, food and water weren't the highlights of imprisonment, but they were the anchors, daily markers that kept time moving in a place where time often felt suspended. Time inside a medieval dungeon didn't move the way it did on the surface. Days didn't unfold through sunlight and activity. Nights didn't announce themselves through darkness. They were already in darkness. Instead, time softened, blurred, and changed texture. And in that strange environment, prisoners built routines, not because they had schedules, but because routines were one of the few ways to stay human in a world designed to take that away. Most routines were small. A prisoner might begin each morning, whatever morning meant, by stretching their arms or flexing their fingers, reminding themselves that their body still worked despite the cold and damp. They might touch the wall to feel how much moisture had gathered overnight. They might count breaths to stay calm. They might whisper a prayer, not necessarily out of devoutness but out of habit. These tiny rituals became anchors. Some prisoners developed patterns to keep track of time. They would scratch a small mark when food arrived, or tap the stone floor after every handful of water, or use sounds from above, like footsteps, distant voices, the clatter of pots, to estimate parts of the day. Others found structure through conversation if they weren't alone. Two prisoners sharing a cell might designate certain hours for quiet, others for talking, others for resting. Conversations became stories, memories, reflections, anything to give shape to hours that otherwise had no form. In some dungeons, prisoners created soft communication networks. A cough in a certain rhythm, a tap on a pipe, a whispered greeting through a crack in the wall. Nothing dramatic, just simple reminders that another human being existed nearby. Breathing routines became survival habits, deep breaths to stay warm, slow breaths to stay calm, rhythmic breaths to fight panic during nights when the stillness felt suffocating. The psychological value of these routines was immense. Where the environment created monotony, routines created identity. Where the dungeon removed structure, prisoners rebuilt it quietly, one small act at a time. Movement, even limited movement, became another pattern. Standing, then sitting. Leaning, then stretching. Walking short circles when space allowed. Touching the ceiling or walls to keep muscles active. Some prisoners whispered old songs to themselves. Not loudly, not boldly, but gently, the way someone might hum to calm a child. The tune didn't matter. The rhythm did. Memory also became its own kind of structure. Prisoners would go through stories they knew. Childhood tales, family events, religious verses, replaying them slowly, as though turning pages that only existed in the mind. Over time, this mental routine could become a refuge, a quiet inner room built inside a place of stone. Prisoners noticed subtle environmental changes that people above would never think twice about. The way the air felt slightly colder on certain days, the faint scent of rain even if no sunlight ever reached them, the faraway echo of a gate opening above, the soft vibrations of carts rolling across the castle courtyard, the shift in footsteps during festivals or market days. These small sensory signals became the closest thing they had to a calendar. Eventually, the body adapted as well. Eyes adjusted to darkness, skin adjusted to cool stone. Muscles learned to conserve warmth through tiny, efficient movements. Hearing sharpened. turning faint sounds into hints of the world beyond the walls. Adaptation didn't mean comfort, but it meant survival. Some prisoners described, in later historical writings, how their dreams changed. The longer they stayed underground, the more vivid their dreams became, reflecting places they once knew: sunlit fields, running water, open skies, the smell of wood smoke. Dreams became a place of temporary escape, a reminder of a world they hoped to return to. And through all of this, a prisoner's mind constantly adjusted. The first days were filled with comparison, remembering freedom and noticing the loss. Later days shifted toward acceptance, adapting to new routines. Eventually, the mind aimed simply for balance, holding on to identity while adapting to limitation. Some prisoners even reported a strange sense of peace at certain moments, not because conditions were kind, but because routines created tiny islands of stability in a sea of uncertainty. In a sense, adaptation was the quiet triumph of those trapped underground. It wasn't loud or heroic in a dramatic way. It was human resilience expressed through the smallest possible actions. Nothing spectacular, just a series of steady choices that said, "I am still here. I am still me. I have not disappeared into the darkness." And in a world built to silence them, that was a profound victory. When you picture a medieval dungeon, you might imagine a crude hole in the ground, carved with little thought and maintained with even less effort. But the truth was far more deliberate. These spaces were designed, not haphazardly, not carelessly, but intentionally, to serve a particular purpose: containment. Not comfort, not rehabilitation, containment. A dungeon wasn't merely a dark room, it was an extension of the castle above it, a tool of governance, a physical expression of authority, and a message carved into stone about who held power and who did not. The architecture reflected this purpose with remarkable clarity. The first thing a prisoner would notice, long before they even reached the dungeon itself, was the descent. The pathway downward always felt longer than expected, carved in tight angles, narrow staircases, and twisting corridors that made it difficult to track direction. These passages weren't designed for graceful movement. They were designed to disorient. Every turn, every bend, every sudden drop forced a prisoner to lose their sense of orientation. Even if they'd been brought down blindfolded or in darkness, the architecture itself made escape feel impossible. Above ground, a person could identify the horizon. Underground, there was no such reference point, just stone. The doors that separated dungeon sections were another deliberate design choice. Thick, reinforced, structured to absorb pressure and sound. Many were built with multiple layers, wood reinforced with iron, then supported by stone frames. The gaps around the door were intentionally small, making it difficult for sound to travel. A prisoner yelling for help would hear their own voice far more clearly than anyone above would. Ventilation shafts, when they existed, were narrow and angled, designed to maintain airflow without creating obvious escape routes. The shafts often widened only at the very top, near the surface, ensuring that no human body could climb through. Any sound traveling upward would scatter in these angled passages, breaking apart into faint whispers long before reaching daylight. The walls were constructed with incredible precision. This wasn't rough stone piled together, it was stone fitted tightly, block by block, to distribute weight evenly. Builders understood that underground structures required stability, especially beneath heavy castles. The result, walls that were solid, thick, and almost unnervingly quiet. Even when a prisoner leaned against them, they absorbed sound rather than reflecting it. This added to the feeling of isolation. Voices didn't bounce, footsteps didn't echo. Every sound felt swallowed by stone. The placement of cells within the dungeon was just as intentional. Cells were often located near corners or deep interior sections, not along straight corridors. This meant that even if a prisoner managed to open a door, they wouldn't have a clear path ahead. They would face curves, dead ends, changes in elevation, a labyrinth designed to bewilder. Some dungeons even integrated slight slopes in their floors, subtle enough that a prisoner might not notice consciously, but strong enough to influence how water pooled or how steps felt underfoot. These gradients guided movement, directing rainwater toward drainage channels or away from particular areas. From the perspective of a castle's designers, nothing inside a dungeon existed by accident. Ceilings were kept low. This wasn't only a matter of conserving materials. It was a psychological tool. A lower ceiling made the space feel smaller, heavier, more oppressive. Prisoners could never fully stand tall in some cells, forcing constant adjustment of posture. That physical constraint communicated a message. This space was not meant to welcome you. Even lighting, or the absence of it, was a calculated part of the experience. Dungeons weren't lit for prisoners. They were lit for guards. Torches were positioned near entry points or along guard paths, not near cells themselves. Light was a controlled resource, and most of it never reached the interior spaces where people were held. This meant prisoners lived in a perpetual dusk or near darkness, while guards enjoyed visibility. Some of the most forward-thinking builders incorporated acoustic principles into their designs. Long before the science of acoustics was formalized, masons understood how sound moved in enclosed spaces. They built walls and corridors that muffled noise, ensuring that even loud disruptions wouldn't carry far. It was architectural psychology long before the term existed, but perhaps the most striking aspect was how seamlessly dungeons blended into the castle's defensive design. They were placed in sections least vulnerable to attack, usually beneath thick walls or towers, where collapsing stone was unlikely even during siege. This meant that prisoners remained secure even if the castle was under threat. The integration also meant that dungeon entrances were positioned for maximum guard control. There were choke points, narrow doorways, bottleneck staircases, places where a single guard could stand and block movement entirely. If someone attempted escape, they would face these architectural obstacles long before encountering actual guards. And yet, despite all these features, dungeons weren't uniform. Each region, each castle, each century brought variations in design. Some dungeons had multiple tiers, upper holding areas and deeper, more restrictive lower levels. Others had just a single floor carved directly into bedrock. Some were dry and dusty, others were damp, connected to natural springs or underground water tables. But the purpose remained consistent. These spaces were never built to comfort, to rehabilitate, or to educate. They were built to contain, in the most literal and psychological sense of the word. When you step back and view them not as random medieval relics, but as engineered environments, it becomes clear. A dungeon wasn't just a place. It was a system, a structure designed to remove options, undermine confidence, and make the outside world feel impossibly far away, even if it was just a few meters up a staircase. And that is why, centuries later, walking into a preserved dungeon still sends a chill up the spine. The architecture may be old, but the intention carved into every stone is unmistakable. If you truly want to understand what life was like inside a medieval dungeon, you cannot stop at the prisoners. Because beneath every dungeon, beneath every decision, every locked door, every hour that passed in the dark, stood another group of people whose lives were shaped just as deeply by those stone walls. The guards, not the shining knights of popular stories, nor the proud soldiers who marched in festivals and parades. Dungeon guards lived in a world that existed parallel to the surface, yet felt entirely separate from it. Their lives unfolded in the same cold corridors, the same dim torchlight, the same echoing silence that shaped the experiences of the prisoners themselves. A guard's day began early, long before sunlight reached the upper courtyards. They'd descend the narrow staircases with a mixture of resignation and routine, holding torches whose flames bent and flickered in the stale air. Some guards served in dungeons voluntarily. Steady employment meant steady pay, but many were assigned by necessity. It wasn't a glamorous post, but it was work. And for some men, that was enough. Above ground, they were invisible. Below ground, they were authority. A guard's responsibilities were far broader than merely ensuring no one escaped. They were record keepers, ration managers, maintenance inspectors, and intermediaries between the imprisoned and the outside world. Each morning, guards checked that cell doors were secure, counted prisoners, and noted any changes in health or behavior, not out of compassion, but because they needed to maintain order. Their duties included escorting prisoners to hearings, carrying messages for those who still had connections beyond the walls, and ensuring that basic routines were maintained. But the task that defined their role most completely was presence. They were there, always there, in a space where time seemed to stop. Contrary to popular imagination, dungeon guards did not constantly stomp through the halls or bark commands. More often, they sat in alcoves or stood at posts for long, quiet hours. The monotony was taxing. Many guards spent so much time in the dimness that their eyes grew sensitive to full daylight. Returning to the surface at the end of a shift could be disorienting, almost painful. The emotional distance between guard and prisoner varied widely. Some guards maintained a professional barrier, polite, detached, neither cruel nor kind. Others were more hardened, shaped by years of dealing with desperate men and uncomfortable conditions. And then there were the rare few who were sympathetic, offering an extra scrap of bread or a moment of conversation to someone who needed it. But in all cases, the guard's life was shaped by the same forces that weighed on the prisoners: cold, damp, silence, and isolation. The dungeon changed them too. Some developed a particular sensitivity to sounds: the drop of water, the distant clank of a chain, the shift of movement in a nearby cell. Others developed strong internal resistance to fear, because the dungeon was full of things that could unsettle even hardened men. Unexpected echoes, strange drafts, the sense of being watched even when the cells were still. The job carried its own anxieties. A guard who fell asleep might face severe punishment. A guard who lost a key, who misplaced a record, who misunderstood a command. Any mistake could cost him wages, reputation, or position. And because most guards lived close to the castle or fortress, their communities knew exactly where they worked. Some families carried a quiet pride that their father or son held a position of trust. Others carried unease, not because the job was dishonorable, but because the dungeon left marks on people. A dungeon guard rarely spoke about his work, not because it was shameful, but because it was difficult to describe. How could he explain the weight of silence? The feeling of descending each morning past stones worn smooth by generations of footsteps? The odd sense that time passed differently below ground? The men who guarded the prisoners walked between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. They lived in the same town or village as everyone else, but spent their days in a space untouched by daylight or normal life. This dual existence shaped their personality, their habits, even their sleep patterns. Many guards developed a preference for dimly lit rooms and quiet evenings long after they left their post. And though they held authority, they were also aware of a quiet truth. In another life, in another set of circumstances, they might easily have been on the other side of the bars. That awareness sometimes softened their treatment of prisoners. Other times it hardened it. Dungeon guards were human, navigating an environment that tested patience, empathy, and endurance. When we imagine medieval dungeons, we often focus on those locked behind the doors. But the people holding the keys walked their own difficult path through those cold corridors, one marked by duty, routine, and the strange rhythms of a life lived between darkness and daylight. If you close your eyes and imagine a medieval dungeon, you might picture darkness first, maybe cold second. But in reality, one of the most defining features of life below ground was neither darkness nor temperature, it was sound, or rather the strange absence of it. A dungeon had its own soundscape, one that shaped every hour of existence for prisoners and guards alike. Understanding that soundscape gives us a deeper sense of what these spaces truly felt like. The first thing anyone noticed when descending into a dungeon was the immediate shift in acoustics. Stone walls absorbed very little, so every small motion seemed to echo endlessly. The clink of a key against a belt, a guard's footsteps on uneven floors, a drop of water hitting the ground after sliding down the wall. These sounds repeated themselves in slow, rhythmic patterns that defined the passing of time. For prisoners, those drops became clocks. A steady drip in the corner might repeat every few seconds. Another might land in a small puddle with a delicate splash. After weeks or months, prisoners could distinguish between the patterns, almost as though the environment itself had developed a voice, quiet but present. Some nights drafts moved through narrow ventilation shafts, creating faint tones, soft whistles or hollow hums that could feel almost musical or unsettling depending on the listener's state of mind. A few historical accounts mention prisoners who believed the dungeon itself was speaking to them, though modern understanding suggests they were interpreting natural sounds through the lens of fear, stress, and isolation. Then there were the distant noises from above. Life continued in the world outside. The clatter of carts in the courtyard, the ring of a blacksmith's hammer in the workshop, the murmur of voices passing near a stairwell, the tolling of church bells announcing morning, noon, or a feast day. These sounds filtered downward in muffled form, as though coming from a different reality entirely. For prisoners, these faint hints of above-ground life could be comforting or painful. They were reminders that the world had not stopped simply because they had vanished from it. Inside the dungeon itself, communication between cells was complex. Some spaces were close enough that prisoners could hear one another breathing or shifting. Others were separated by heavy stone or thick wooden doors, creating long stretches of silence where a person could feel completely alone. When prisoners did communicate, they often did so by tapping, a finger or knuckle against stone, patterns learned and repeated, a rudimentary form of language born from necessity. Even then, guards were often able to hear these taps, but many ignored them unless they believed something important was happening. In a place defined by repetition, a few taps here and there rarely threatened the routine. Guards moved differently underground. They walked more slowly, more carefully, letting their ears guide them. They could tell when a prisoner shifted restlessly, when someone was pacing, or when someone was speaking softly to themselves. In a space where every sound was magnified, silence carried its own implications. Too much silence could worry a guard just as much as too much noise. Either one might prompt inspection. Night in the dungeon wasn't truly night, because no light ever reached the cells. But guards changed shifts. Torches dimmed and were replaced, and airflow shifted as temperatures outside changed. These subtle transitions created their own rhythms, marking time for people who couldn't see day or night pass. Some prisoners described the dungeon as a kind of echoing chamber of thought, because the quiet forced them to hear every inner voice, every worry, every unanswered question. Modern psychologists might describe this as sensory deprivation mixed with environmental monotony, conditions known to heighten imagination and introspection. But in the medieval world, prisoners interpreted these experiences through the frameworks they knew: faith, superstition, and personal memory. Some believed they heard the voices of loved ones calling from above. Others reported hearing familiar sounds from their past: horses galloping, ocean waves, wind through trees. These were likely memories replaying themselves in a mind hungry for stimulus. Yet to the prisoners they felt real, at least for a moment. The dungeon soundscape, in its strange mix of silence and echoes, shaped how people thought, how they slept, how they hoped, and how they endured. It was not loud, not violent, not chaotic. It was subtle, ever-present, and deeply psychological. And in many ways, it was one of the most powerful forces at work in the depths. If the soundscape shaped the atmosphere of a medieval dungeon, the architecture shaped its purpose. These spaces were not created randomly or carelessly. They were designed with intent, sometimes crude, sometimes surprisingly sophisticated, but always purposeful. To understand a dungeon, you have to imagine it the way a medieval builder or warden would, as a structure meant not only to confine bodies, but to influence behavior, maintain order, and signal authority. Most dungeons weren't standalone buildings. They were built beneath larger structures: castles, city halls, monasteries, or fortified residences. This integration was intentional. It allowed the weight of stone above to reinforce the security below, both physically and symbolically. Being held beneath the very seat of authority created a sense of immovable power. The first layer of design was the approach. Prisoners rarely entered through the same doors used by nobles, guards, or common visitors. Dungeons had their own passages: narrow staircases, low arches, and angled hallways that created a gradual psychological shift as people descended. As each step took them deeper underground, the air cooled, the light dimmed, and the sounds of the surface faded. By the time someone reached the bottom, they already felt far from the world they knew. Doors were another critical element. A medieval dungeon door was not merely a barrier. It was a boundary that controlled air, sound, movement, and perception. Thick wooden planks reinforced with iron bands were the most common design. Small openings, no larger than a hand, might be cut into the center for passing food or checking conditions inside. These openings were intentionally small. They preserved the guard's safety while limiting the prisoner's view of the outside world. Some doors had no openings at all. In those cases, guards relied entirely on sound, listening for breathing, movement, or calls, to know whether a prisoner was awake, asleep, or needing attention. In these cells, time became even more abstract for the people inside. Ventilation was subtle but essential. Medieval builders understood that air had to move, even in the deepest chambers. Narrow shafts, often disguised within stone walls, created small but consistent airflow. These were not designed for comfort. They were designed for necessity. A single shaft might serve several cells, bringing in just enough fresh air to prevent suffocation. The resulting airflow produced faint drafts that shifted throughout the day, letting prisoners sense changes in weather they could not see. The layout of cells varied widely. Some were single occupancy, sized for one person to sit or lie down. Others were larger rooms where several people might be held at once. Merchants, travelers, debtors, or villagers awaiting resolution of a local dispute. Shared spaces created their own dynamics. Conversations, tensions, alliances, and routines that emerged from necessity rather than choice. Water management was one of the most underappreciated elements of dungeon design. Medieval builders had to consider the natural flow of groundwater, rain seepage, and drainage. Some dungeons had stone gutters carved into the floors, directing moisture toward a central channel. Others had slightly sloped floors that encouraged runoff toward an exit point. These systems weren't always perfect. During especially wet seasons, water accumulated more quickly than the drainage could handle. This created a unique rhythm underground, a cycle of dampness and drying, influenced by weather many meters above. Lighting was another deliberate choice. Most cells received no direct light, but hallways and guard stations often had torch mounts built directly into the stone. These mounts were placed at intervals that allowed guards to see the corridor without lighting every torch at once, saving resources while maintaining awareness. The warm glow of a single torch could create long shadows that stretched elegantly across curved stone walls. Guards grew familiar with these shadows, knowing when something in the environment changed. But perhaps the most telling feature of dungeon architecture was the deliberate use of thresholds. Every doorway, every arch, every stair represented a transition. Medieval society placed enormous symbolic value on the crossing of thresholds. To step through one was to move into a new state of being. For prisoners, the descent into the dungeon was not just physical, it was psychological. And for those who were released, stepping back through the final doorway into daylight felt like emerging from another world. The architecture was not meant to punish through harm. It was meant to control through environment, managing space, movement, sound, and experience in ways that shaped human behavior. When you study these spaces closely, you start to realize something surprising. Medieval builders understood far more about environmental psychology than we often assume. They created spaces that influenced the mind as much as they confined the body, and that perhaps is the most revealing truth of all. Life inside a medieval dungeon did not exist in isolation from the world above. Even in the dimmest chambers, an economy, quiet, subtle, and often invisible, was constantly at work. It wasn't the kind of economy measured in coins alone. It was one defined by access, influence, relationships, and small privileges that became enormously meaningful in confinement. To understand this hidden system, you must remember that medieval justice was rarely a simple binary of guilt and innocence. Many detainees were held temporarily, awaiting a hearing, settling a dispute, or paying off a debt. Others were merchants who had crossed local regulations, travelers who lacked proper documentation, or villagers involved in civil disagreements. In this environment, everyday necessities became currency. The most basic form of economic exchange was food. A standard ration might be provided by the authority overseeing the dungeon, but these rations varied dramatically in quality and frequency, depending on local custom and resources. Anything beyond the standard provision required a transaction. Family members visiting from the outside could bring additional food, often through negotiation with guards. A traveler who had been arrested with personal belongings might exchange small items, brooches, rings, cloth, for better meals. Those who had nothing to barter sometimes shared resources among themselves, forming alliances based on mutual support. But food was only the beginning. Light itself became a commodity. A small candle, which above ground might burn unnoticed in a corner, became a treasure underground. Light allowed someone to read, pray, repair clothing, or simply measure time. Prisoners who received candles from family members or sympathetic guards shared them strategically, often in exchange for companionship, information, or favors that eased daily life. Information was another form of currency. News from the surface world, court decisions, market conditions, nearby conflicts, or even weather updates held immense value. A guard who shared a snippet of gossip could instantly shift social dynamics within a shared cell. A detainee with external visitors could become a source of knowledge, gaining influence purely by being connected. Then there were the small comforts that rarely appear in official records: an extra blanket during winter, a wooden cup instead of drinking from a shared bowl, or the chance to step briefly into a corridor with moving air. None of these privileges were guaranteed. All of them flowed through relationships. The guards played a central role. Contrary to popular mythology, many medieval guards were not cruel or indifferent. They were workers, men with families, routines, and social obligations. Their duties included record-keeping, escorting, ration distribution, and maintaining security. Within these duties, they made countless small discretionary decisions each day. Which detainee gets an extra moment of fresh air while the torches are being changed? Who receives their meal slightly earlier? Whose request for water is granted promptly? Such decisions influence morale and behavior without ever being written down. Over time, patterns emerged. Some guards were known for fairness, others for strict adherence to rules, a few for taking advantage of their position. Prisoners quickly learned which personalities governed their daily rhythm. Above the guards were the stewards or officials who oversaw the broader operation. These individuals decided when repairs were needed, how supplies were allocated, and how resources were distributed among different wings of a castle or city holding area. Their priorities affected everything underground, often unintentionally. A budget cut in the main hall might reduce the quality of grain sent to the dungeon. A new policy from a city council could change visiting hours. The subtle ripple effects shaped life in ways that prisoners felt daily. But the most fascinating part of this underground economy was the formation of micro-communities. Shared hardships created bonds that might never have formed above ground. People who came from different villages, trades, or social standings found themselves cooperating, sharing stories, pooling resources, teaching each other skills, or planning how to manage uncertainty. In these moments, humanity asserted itself quietly and persistently. A merchant might give advice to a young shepherd. A scholar might recount memories of distant lands. A traveler might soothe the fears of someone new to confinement. None of this appears in legal documents or architectural plans, but it was deeply real, an economy of resilience and mutual support. When you see a dungeon only as a place of confinement, you miss half the truth. It was also a living environment shaped by countless decisions, exchanges, and relationships. In the depths of stone corridors where time seemed to stand still, people created meaning, community, and structure in whatever ways they could. And in doing so, they turned even the quietest corner of a medieval fortress into a reflection of the broader world above. One of the most disorienting aspects of medieval dungeon life wasn't the darkness, the confinement, or the uncertainty. It was time itself, how it stretched, folded, and slipped away in ways that felt nothing like the world above. In a medieval town, time was measured by church bells, market openings, sunrise, sunset, and the consistent rhythm of daily tasks. People woke with the light, worked with the sun, and rested when darkness fell. Everything moved in predictable cycles, but underground those rhythms vanished. Many dungeons had no windows at all. Others had narrow slits that allowed a faint suggestion of daylight, but only enough to confirm that the world outside still existed, not enough to anchor one's sense of time. In deeper chambers, torches were the only source of illumination, and those torches were lit according to the needs of guards, not the inhabitants. A torch might burn for a long stretch one day and barely flicker the next, offering no consistency. So detainees learned to invent their own systems. Some marked time through sound, the echo of footsteps at regular intervals, the distant noise of a gate opening or closing, the movement of guards during scheduled rounds. Even these sounds were imperfect, because guards changed shifts, visitors arrived unpredictably, and the acoustics distorted distance. Still, those who stayed long enough learned to detect subtle details, patterns invisible to newcomers. Others tracked time through their bodies, the rhythm of hunger between meals, the heaviness of fatigue after restless sleep. The sensation of cold during certain hours when winds outside shifted, but even the body's clock could falter. Hunger was unreliable when rations varied. Sleep became fragmented. Light, interrupted, easily broken by distant noise. In such an environment, days and nights dissolved into a single continuous stretch of existence. Some prisoners created rituals to anchor time, a quiet prayer repeated at intervals, reciting a memorized story from beginning to end, whispering lessons learned in childhood, walking the length of the cell a certain number of times. These rituals became more than habits. They were lifelines, helping maintain a sense of identity when the outside world felt distant and unreachable. Guards also shaped the perception of time. When meals were delivered, when inspections occurred, when someone was escorted to meet an official, each of these moments broke the monotony. A guard who arrived slightly earlier or later could shift a prisoner's entire sense of the day. For someone confined long enough, these small changes felt like earthquakes in the flow of time. Perhaps the most striking example comes from medieval texts describing detainees emerging into daylight after extended confinement. Chroniclers write of individuals shielding their eyes, overwhelmed not just by the brightness but by the realization of how many days had passed unnoticed. Some believed only a few days had gone by, only to learn weeks had passed. Others felt certain they had endured months, when in truth it had been far shorter. This distortion didn't come from suffering alone. It came from being removed from the natural cues humans rely on: the movement of the sun, the chatter of townspeople, the calling of vendors, the rhythms of community life. And yet, within this suspended world of blurred hours, people adapted. They learned to read the faint patterns of life in the corridors. They gauged time by the cooling of a stone floor. They paid attention to the smallest shifts in sound and air. In the absence of clocks, they became clocks themselves, living instruments interpreting every nuance of their environment. This adaptation wasn't just survival, it was resilience, a quiet, profound determination to maintain a sense of self when the very concept of morning and night threatened to dissolve. And in those dim chambers, where the world's natural rhythms barely reached, prisoners discovered something modern people rarely encounter. Time, when stripped of its familiar structure, changes the way a person understands their own existence. In a medieval dungeon, silence was never absolute. It only felt overwhelming because every sound carried more weight than it would above ground. Down there, even the smallest noise took on a strange significance, becoming part of an unspoken language, one prisoners used to understand their environment, their captors, and sometimes each other. At first, newcomers heard noise the way anyone would: echoing footsteps, a distant clank of metal, the groan of hinges struggling against age. But as time passed, these sounds separated into patterns, textures, and meanings. Footsteps told stories. A slow, dragging stride meant a tired guard ending his shift. A brisk, confident walk indicated someone higher in authority. Two sets of feet in quick succession suggested an escort, either someone being brought in or someone being taken out. And because sound traveled strangely underground, echoes often distorted the distance. A footstep might seem close when it was far. It might sound behind when it came from ahead. Prisoners learned to map these distortions, building mental diagrams of corridors they had never seen. Keys were another form of communication. The faint jingle of metal from down a hallway meant movement long before figures appeared. The sound of keys brushing cloth meant a cell door might open soon. The heavier clatter of a full ring indicated a guard responsible for multiple areas. Some prisoners could distinguish the individual key rings of different guards, their size, their weight, the way they struck one another. Over time, that knowledge became a survival tool. Doors spoke even louder. A wooden door that creaked meant age and disrepair. A reinforced door that opened with a low thud meant deeper confinement. A screeching iron gate usually indicated the entrance to a main corridor, one many prisoners never saw. Even the sound of a latch sliding home carried emotion. A rushed, careless latch signaled a guard eager to return to warmth. A slow, deliberate latch suggested caution or suspicion. A double check of the lock meant someone inside had caused trouble recently. Water also played its part, dripping from stone ceilings, trickling through cracks after rainfall, pooling quietly in unseen corners. Some prisoners used the rhythm of water to estimate time, counting the intervals between drops, or noticing how the sound changed when the weather above shifted. Others used it to stay calm, letting the steady drip become a grounding presence in a world where calmness was scarce. But the most meaningful sounds came from people, often without words. A cough from another cell meant someone else was still alive. A shifting body against straw meant restlessness or discomfort. A quiet sigh from nearby reminded prisoners that they weren't alone in that silent world. Sometimes, when guards were far away and the night felt long, people communicated by tapping gently on walls, not in full conversations, just enough to say, "I'm here. You're not alone. I'm still fighting." These exchanges weren't always allowed, and many dungeons discouraged communication entirely. But even then, people found ways. A sharp tap for warning, a double tap for reassurance, a long, dragged knuckle for caution. In a place where voices might carry into the wrong ears, these faint, coded sounds became the closest thing to companionship many would experience. And yet, silence mattered just as much, because silence wasn't empty. Silence was information. Pure silence meant no guards nearby. Interrupted silence meant movement. A prolonged stretch of silence after a disturbance meant trouble was being resolved elsewhere. In this environment, sound became a map, a clock, a warning system, and sometimes a friend. But above all, it became a reminder of life beyond the stone walls. A reminder that even in confinement, the world still moved, breathed, and continued. The ability to interpret this language of sound was not taught. It was learned through necessity, through long nights, through careful attention, through the strange sharpening of perception that came when every moment carried weight. Down in those dungeons, hearing was more than a sense. It was survival. Inside a medieval dungeon, the concept of day didn't disappear. It simply stopped behaving the way nature intended. Without sunlight, without shadows, without any visible change in the world outside their cell, prisoners experienced time in a strange, elastic way. Some said hours stretched endlessly. Others said entire days vanished in what felt like minutes. Most simply stopped trying to count. But even in absolute darkness, human beings searched for patterns. And slowly, they discovered that dungeons had their own kind of rhythm, one shaped not by sunlight, but by human routines above and around them. The first marker was sound. Far above the dungeon, a city woke at dawn. People walked the streets. Carts rumbled over cobblestones. Market vendors shouted. Blacksmiths hammered. Church bells rang. The noises were faint, muffled by layers of stone and earth, but they existed, and prisoners learned to listen for them. The distant sound of church bells, soft, almost a memory, often became the closest thing they had to a clock. The first bell meant morning. The next few meant midday. The final deeper tolls meant evening. It wasn't much, but it formed the skeleton of a day. Then came the guards. Their rotation schedule, though not always consistent, still created patterns prisoners could recognize. A change in footsteps, a different voice, a metallic jingle with a distinct rhythm. The new guard's habit of clearing his throat or humming without realizing it. The arrival of food, however simple, was another anchor. A bowl placed quietly outside the cell. A ladle scraping the bottom of a pot. The sliding of a tray across stone. The scent of warm broth. The earthy smell of baked grain. Even the faint aroma of herbs on rare days when the cook was generous. To a prisoner, these hints meant more than nourishment. They meant time still moved. And yet, nights were different. Nights in dungeons didn't get darker because darkness was constant. Instead, they became quieter. The city above went still. Wind replaced footsteps. Rats moved more boldly. Water dripped in slower, heavier rhythms. The guards spoke less. Sometimes they nodded off. Sometimes they patrolled lazily, their footsteps more measured. And in that stillness, prisoners found themselves face to face with their own thoughts, thoughts that felt louder than any sound. Many described the nights as the heaviest hours, not because of fear, not because of solitude, but because silence forced them inward, into memories and regrets they tried all day to avoid. Some remembered families. Some remembered mistakes. Some remembered the moment they entered the dungeon, replaying it again and again as if searching for a different outcome. And some, those who had spent the longest time underground, adapted so fully to this strange rhythm that they could identify subtle differences few others noticed. A slightly warmer current of air? That meant daytime warmth filtering down through cracks. A faint shift in the echo of footsteps? That meant humidity rising, likely evening. A change in the scent of the air, less earthy, more crisp. That meant night winds outside were strengthening. In a world without sun or moon, without visible hours or seasons, human beings still found ways to sense the passage of time. It wasn't precise, it wasn't reliable, but it was human. Because even in confinement, even buried underground, people refused to let time simply disappear. They shaped it themselves, through sound, through memory, through routine, and through the quiet resilience that allowed them to keep going. And in that way, the rhythm of dungeon life, slow, heavy, muted, became part of the survival story itself. The dungeon took away freedom. It took away light. But it never fully took away time. People always found ways to reclaim it. One of the strangest realities of life inside a medieval dungeon was that the outside world kept changing, winter to spring, summer to fall, yet none of it could be seen. No blooming trees, no shifting colors, no frost forming on rooftops, no sunlight warming stone. And yet prisoners still felt the seasons, not through sight, but through subtler signals that filtered down into the underground world. Winter was the easiest to recognize. The air grew sharper, colder, and somehow thinner. Moisture clung to stone walls longer, and condensation formed on chains and iron bars. Footsteps above sounded slower, heavier, as people trudged through snow-covered streets. And during especially cold winters, the dungeon itself seemed to wait in stillness. Water dripped slower, rats moved quietly, and the entire underground space took on a deeper silence, as if the world outside were holding its breath. Spring was harder to detect. There were no flowers, no shifting skies, only subtle changes. The air became slightly less heavy. Earthy scents grew stronger as rainwater seeped down from above. Distant sounds carried differently, street chatter rising earlier and lasting longer into the evening. And sometimes, after heavy spring rain, the scent of wet grass drifted faintly through cracks in the stone. Summer, strangely, felt the most oppressive. Heat sank downward and settled in the lower spaces, creating a warmth that didn't comfort but weighed heavily on the skin. The air felt still, thick, almost unmoving. The only relief came at night, when cool breezes from above finally crept into the darkness. But summer also brought the loudest days. Markets above bustled. Travelers arrived and departed. Horses clattered down cobblestone roads, children played in courtyards. Blacksmiths hammered longer, their work echoing deep into the dungeon. To prisoners, these sounds were a reminder of a world still turning without them. Autumn brought its own kind of melancholy. Prisoners felt the chill return gradually. The air carried the smell of dry leaves, though faint and hard to trace. Rainfall grew heavier, striking wooden trapdoors with rhythms that were unmistakable. And people above spoke in quieter tones, harvest voices preparing for colder months. Some prisoners said autumn was the season that hurt the most, not physically, but emotionally. It reminded them of endings, of cycles completing, of time slipping, of the outside world marching steadily toward winter again. And every season brought different guards. Some guards dreaded winter nights and rushed their patrols. Some became more irritable in summer heat. Some were more generous in spring, moods lifted by the changing world. Some grew harsh in autumn, perhaps sensing the year's weight on their own shoulders. Through these shifts, guard behavior, air temperature, moisture, sounds, prisoners built an internal calendar that was shockingly accurate. Some long-term prisoners could tell the month within a narrow window. A few could sense the approach of winter long before the first frost above. Others knew exactly when summer heat peaked and began to fade. It was a subtle skill born not of freedom but of necessity. Because when all you have is darkness, you begin noticing every detail the world gives you, even the ones most people overlook. And so seasons continued to pass, unseen, but not unfelt. Each one carved itself into the memories of those underground. Each one reminded them that life continued outside, that nature still moved in cycles, even if their own lives seemed stuck in stasis. And for many prisoners, the changing seasons became one more thing to hold on to, a quiet promise that the world above remained alive, a reminder that time flowed forward even when they could not, a small, fragile hope that someday they might see the sky again and feel the seasons directly, not through echoes, but with their own eyes. And perhaps what lingers most from these unseen seasons is the quiet reminder that time never truly stops. It continues its steady rhythm, even in the deepest stillness. And as we slowly make our way back up from these quiet depths, perhaps it helps to remember that every stone, every whisper of air, every faint echo in those forgotten corridors was once part of someone's world, a world smaller than ours, darker than ours, and yet shaped by the same emotions we know today: fear, hope, regret, resilience. In the silence of those underground chambers, time seemed to stretch in ways almost impossible to describe. Days blended into nights, seasons passed unmarked, and the world above moved on without those who waited in the shadows. And yet, Even in places built to contain despair, there were moments of thought, memory, and quiet endurance that belonged only to the human heart. Tonight, as you lie somewhere warm, with soft light or gentle darkness around you, you're experiencing a kind of comfort they could barely imagine. A roof that shelters you, walls that protect you, air that circulates freely, and a world that will still be waiting for you in the morning. So let the quiet of this moment be your own kind of sanctuary. Let your breath fall into an easy rhythm. Let the weight of the day slip off your shoulders, and let the distant past fade softly into the background, like the last ember of a candle dimming at the far end of a corridor. Because whatever burdens you carried into tonight, you don't have to hold them right now. Not in this moment, not here. Sleep well, knowing you are safe, you are warm, and you are surrounded by light that countless people before you never had. Sleep knowing that the world you wake up to will be brighter than the one we explored tonight. Good night, and dream gently.